The shipping manifest clearly stated research specimens, handle with extreme care, but nobody bothered to read the fine print. Dr. Sam Bennett watched the cargo containers float through the airlock of the research vessel Aurora's Edge, each one labeled with neat little tags that meant absolutely nothing to the alien crew members. Supervising the transfer, Sam had been waiting 3 months for this shipment from Earth. The Galactic Council had finally approved his request to study Earth fauna in a controlled space environment. What they didn't know was that Earth's definition of controlled and the galaxy's definition of controlled were about as compatible as fire and oxygen. The first few containers held exactly what everyone expected. Lab rats scurried around in their clear boxes. Hamsters ran on their wheels, and a few rabbits sat quietly munching on synthetic carrots. Chief Security Officer Nala clicked her mandibles approvingly as she checked each container against her list. The tall insectoid Kefri had dealt with research animals before, and these seemed perfectly normal. Then they opened container number 5. The creature inside looked like someone had taken a small bear, flattened it slightly, and given it the attitude of a drunk pirate. It was mostly black with white stripes running down its back, and it was currently trying to bite through the supposedly indestructible containment glass with teeth that seemed far too sharp for something so small. "What exactly is that thing?" asked engineering lead Bren, his crystalline skin shifting through worried purple hues. The methodical Vorthak preferred order and predictability, and this small Earth creature radiated neither. Sam consulted his datapad and tried to keep his voice casual. "That's a honey badger, species name Mellivora capensis. We call this one 5 because he's specimen number 5. It looks angry," Nala observed, watching as 5 switched from biting the glass to systematically testing every corner of his container with his claws. "Oh, he's not angry," Sam replied cheerfully. "That's just how honey badgers are. They don't really get angry. They don't get scared either. They just are." Bren's crystalline features shifted into what might have been confusion among his species. "I don't understand. What emotional state is it in then?" Sam thought about this for a moment. Imagine if you took the concept of "I don't care" and gave it teeth and claws. That's basically a honey badger. As if to demonstrate this point, 5 had found the container's air filtration grate and was methodically unscrewing it with his claws. The grate was supposedly tamper-proof, designed to resist the efforts of any known research specimen. "Should we be concerned?" Nala asked, watching 5 work with the focused intensity of a professional safecracker. "Probably," Sam admitted. But before he could explain further, 5 had removed the grate entirely and was squeezing through an opening that seemed physically impossible for his body size. Alarms started blaring as 5 hit the cargo bay floor running. The honey badger paused for exactly 1 second to survey his new environment, decided it was acceptable, and immediately began exploring the nearest wall panel with his claws. "Security Protocol 7, Nala barked into her communicator. "Escaped research specimen in cargo bay 2. 6 Kefri security officers arrived within minutes, armed with standard containment nets and tranquilizer guns. They spread out in a standard formation that had successfully contained everything from escaped laboratory mice to rampaging Andromedan war beasts. 5 looked at the security team with what could only be described as mild interest, then casually bit through the power cable connecting the cargo bay's main lighting system to the ship's electrical grid. The bay plunged into emergency lighting as sparks flew from the severed cable. 5, completely unbothered by the electrical discharge that should have killed him, continued his exploration of the wall panel. "How is it not dead?" Bren asked in genuine bewilderment. "That cable carries enough current to power a small city." "Honey badgers are notably difficult to kill," Sam explained as he watched 5 discover the ventilation intake and begin squeezing into it. "They've been recorded surviving snake bites that would kill a horse, fighting off lions, and breaking out of every enclosure humans have ever built for them." "Every enclosure?" Nala repeated, her mandibles clicking nervously. "Every single one," Sam confirmed. "We stopped trying after the incident at the San Diego Zoo, where one learned to hotwire the maintenance vehicles. 5 had disappeared entirely into the ventilation system, leaving behind 6 confused security officers and 1 very worried engineering officer. "Where will it go?" Bren asked, his skin now cycling through rapid color changes that indicated extreme stress among his people. Before Sam could answer, they heard the distinctive sound of metal being torn apart. coming from somewhere deep within the ship's infrastructure. Everywhere, Sam said simply. Over the next 6 hours, Five conducted a comprehensive tour of the Aurora's edge. He appeared in the mess hall, where he ate through 3 supposedly impenetrable food storage containers before anyone noticed. He showed up in Engineering Section C, where he somehow managed to open a sealed maintenance panel and sample the lubricants inside. The ship's computer logged 17 separate security breaches, each one lasting exactly as long as it took Five to decide he was bored with that particular location. The crew tried everything. They set up motion sensors, but Five seemed to know exactly where they were and avoided them with casual ease. They put out food to lure him back to the cargo bay, but Five had apparently found the ship's food supplies far more interesting than anything they could offer. They even tried playing recorded honey badger mating calls over the ship's communication system, which only seemed to effuse Five. By the end of the first day, Five had been spotted in every major section of the ship except the bridge, and Sam was beginning to suspect that was only because Five hadn't found it interesting enough to visit yet. Nala found Sam in his quarters, reviewing footage of Five's various appearances throughout the ship. "Dr. Bennett," she said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who had reached the end of their patience, "we need to discuss the parameters of this research project." "I understand your concerns," Sam replied, watching a recording of Five casually dismantling a door lock mechanism that had taken Vorthak engineers 3 years to design. "But I should point out that Five is actually behaving quite normally for his species." "This is normal?" Nala gestured at the screen, where Five was now using the dismantled lock components to build what appeared to be a small fort in one of the storage rooms. "Completely normal," Sam confirmed. "If anything, he's being quite well behaved. Usually they're much more destructive." Nala's mandibles clicked in a pattern that Sam had learned meant she was reconsidering every life choice that had led her to this moment. "Doctor," she said finally, "exactly how many more of these creatures do you have in storage?" Sam checked his manifest again. "Just the 1 honey badger. The rest are all much more manageable." "Good," Nala said, relief evident in her voice. Although, Sam added thoughtfully, "I did put in a request for a wolverine next month." The sound Nala made wasn't quite a scream, but it was close. The maintenance log for the Aurora's edge had never been so interesting to read. In the 2 weeks since Five's arrival, the entries had evolved from standard technical reports to what amounted to a daily chronicle of impossible events. Day 3 had brought the discovery that Five could somehow compress his body to fit through spaces that violated basic physics. The ventilation system, designed with precisely calculated dimensions to prevent any unauthorized access, had become Five's personal highway network. Engineering crews would find his claw marks in areas that required special equipment just to reach. Day 7 marked the first food storage incident. The mess hall's steel containers, rated to withstand meteor impacts and designed to keep out everything from space pirates to hungry Andromedan bears, had been opened like tin cans. Not broken or destroyed, but methodically opened, as if Five possessed some innate understanding of their locking mechanisms. By day 10, Five had somehow accessed the ship's internal communication system. Nobody could figure out how he'd done it, but crew members started receiving random calls consisting of nothing but the sound of determined chewing. Dr. Sam Bennett had stopped sleeping properly. Every time he closed his eyes, another report would come in about Five's latest adventure. The honey badger had developed what could only be described as a routine. He would appear somewhere impossible, investigate everything that caught his interest, sample anything that seemed edible, and then vanish before anyone could respond. The situation reached a new level of complexity when the Aurora's edge docked at mining colony Kepler 7 for their monthly supply run. Colonial Administrator Wex, a pompous Trelawney with an inflated sense of his own importance, had specifically requested to meet the human research team. The Trelawney were considering a cultural exchange program, and Wex wanted to evaluate human scientific methods firsthand. "I trust your specimens are properly contained," Wex said as he toured the ship's research facilities. His purple skin shimmered with self-importance as he examined the various animal containers. "The Trelawney have extensive experience with biological research, and we find that proper containment is essential to meaningful data collection." Sam nodded politely while keeping one eye on Five's container. The honey badger was currently engaged in what appeared to be a staring contest with Wex, and Sam had learned to worry whenever 5 focused his attention on something new. "Of course," Sam replied. "All specimens are secured according to Galactic Council protocols." As if summoned by this statement, 5 casually pushed open his container door and stepped out onto the laboratory floor. The container hadn't been unlocked. The electronic system showed all green lights indicating a fully sealed environment. The backup mechanical locks were still engaged. Yet 5 stood there looking around the laboratory with mild curiosity, as if walking through solid matter was perfectly normal. Wex made a sound that was part squeak, part diplomatic protest. "That creature is loose. He does that," Sam explained, reaching for his emergency containment kit. 5 has never met a container he couldn't escape from. 5, apparently recognizing his name, looked directly at Wex with an expression that somehow conveyed both complete indifference and vague, predatory interest. Then, because the universe had a sense of humor, 5 decided that Wex's elaborate ceremonial boots looked like something worth investigating. What followed could only be described as diplomatic chaos. Wex, a being whose species had never encountered anything quite like a honey badger, fled through the ship's corridors while 5 pursued him with the unhurried determination of a natural disaster. The honey badger wasn't being aggressive, just curious. But Wex's panicked running apparently triggered 5's chase instincts. The pursuit wound through 3 decks, past confused crew members, and finally ended in the colony's main administrative building, when Wex locked himself in his office and called for emergency security. 5, finding the office door locked, spent approximately 30 seconds examining the electronic lock before somehow bypassing it entirely. Security footage later showed him simply placing his paw on the door panel, which then opened as if recognizing his biometric signature. Inside the office, 5 discovered Wex's private food replicator and began systematically ordering different meals to sample. The replicator, programmed to respond to authorized personnel only, accepted every command 5 somehow managed to input despite lacking opposable thumbs or any understanding of Trelawney computer interfaces. By the time Sam and Nala arrived at the office, 5 had successfully ordered and was consuming something called Trelawney Royal Feast Supreme, while Wex cowered behind his desk, muttering about impossible creatures and inadequate human containment protocols. "How did it access my replicator?" Wex demanded. "That system requires a 17-digit authorization code and biometric confirmation." Sam looked at 5, who was delicately sampling what appeared to be synthetic caviar. "He's very good at solving problems." "That's not solving problems, that's breaking the laws of physics." 5 looked up from his meal and made a sound that might have been honey badger laughter. Then he returned to his food, completely unconcerned by the philosophical crisis he was causing. The incident report filed by Wex ran to 47 pages and included recommendations for immediate revision of all Galactic Council protocols regarding Earth fauna. The Trelawney Cultural Exchange Program was put on indefinite hold, with a note that future discussions should take place only after adequate containment measures had been developed. Back on the Aurora's edge, Sam found himself in Chief Security Officer Nala's office, explaining for the 3rd time that week why honey badgers couldn't be contained using conventional methods. "Dr. Bennett," Nala said, her mandibles clicking in the rhythm that indicated maximum frustration, "that creature has now escaped containment 14 times. It has accessed restricted areas, damaged equipment, consumed unauthorized food supplies, and caused a diplomatic incident with a species we were hoping to establish trade relations with." "I know it looks bad," Sam admitted, "but you have to understand that from 5's perspective, he's just exploring his environment and solving interesting puzzles." "Puzzles?" Nala's voice rose to a pitch that made nearby equipment vibrate. "It treated our security systems like puzzles?" "Honey badgers are remarkably intelligent," Sam explained. "They're one of the few species on Earth that can use tools, solve complex problems, and adapt to new situations almost instantly. 5 isn't trying to cause trouble. He's just being himself." Nala pulled up the security footage from the past 2 weeks and played it in fast forward. The result looked like a nature documentary about a small black and white tornado of curiosity tearing through a spaceship. "Doctor," she said finally, "what would happen if we gave this creature actual tools to work with?" Sam considered this question seriously. "I honestly don't know. No one's ever tried it. Please tell me that no one would be foolish enough to try it. Of course not, Sam replied. That would be completely irresponsible. Neither of them noticed engineering apprentice Dan Walsh pausing outside the office door, or the thoughtful expression on his face as he listened to their conversation. In his container, Five had somehow acquired a small wrench and was using it to systematically disassemble the supposedly tamper-proof feeding mechanism. Where he'd gotten the wrench was anybody's guess, but he was using it with the precision of a trained engineer. The maintenance log's most recent entry simply read, "Honey Badger now has tools. God help us all." Engineering apprentice Dan Walsh stared at the maintenance schedule display and wondered if anyone would notice if he accidentally fell into a black hole. While his colleagues were preparing for first contact with the newly discovered Helian species, Dan had been assigned to recalibrate atmospheric processors, clean plasma conduits, and perform 17 other tasks that could easily be done by an automated system. The Helians were apparently a peaceful species with advanced mathematical abilities, which meant every senior engineer on the ship was involved in preparing communication protocols. Every senior engineer except Dan, who was apparently too junior to do anything more exciting than checking air filters. His current assignment involved crawling through maintenance tunnels to replace sensor arrays in the ship's lower decks. It was important work, but it was also mind-numbingly repetitive. Insert sensor, calibrate readings, move to next junction, repeat. Dan had been doing this for 6 hours when he heard the unmistakable sound of metal being systematically disassembled. Following the sound led him to maintenance junction 7, where he discovered Five working on an access panel with intense concentration. The Honey Badger had somehow acquired a complete set of tools and was using them to carefully remove each component of the panel's locking mechanism. "Well, that's new," Dan said aloud. Five looked up at the sound, studied Dan for a moment, then returned to his work. Unlike everyone else on the ship, Dan didn't seem particularly worried about Five's activities, which the Honey Badger apparently found acceptable. Dan watched as Five successfully opened the panel and began investigating the contents. The Honey Badger's approach was methodical and careful, nothing like the random destruction everyone assumed he was causing. Five was actually quite good at this. "You know what you're doing, don't you?" Dan said, settling down to watch. "Everyone thinks you're just breaking stuff, but you're actually figuring out how it all works." Five paused in his exploration and looked at Dan again, this time with what might have been approval. Then he returned to the panel and began carefully reassembling everything exactly as he'd found it. Dan had seen enough engineering students to recognize good technique when he saw it. Five's tool use was precise, his problem-solving approach was logical, and his understanding of mechanical systems was surprisingly sophisticated. More importantly, Five seemed to genuinely enjoy the work. An idea began forming in Dan's mind. It was probably a terrible idea, but Dan was bored enough to find terrible ideas appealing. "Want to help me with something?" he asked Five. Five tilted his head in what Dan chose to interpret as interest. Dan pulled out his diagnostic tablet and showed Five the maintenance schedule. "I've got about 40 more sensor arrays to install, and half of them are in spaces that are really annoying to reach. You're good at getting into tight spaces." Five examined the tablet with surprising focus, then looked at Dan's toolkit. After a moment of consideration, he selected a sensor calibration device and held it up questioningly. "Yeah, that's the one," Dan confirmed. "You attach it to the blue connector, wait for the green light, then move to the next junction." What happened next violated about 17 different safety protocols and probably a few laws of nature. Five not only understood Dan's instructions, he improved on them. The Honey Badger found more efficient routes through the maintenance tunnels, identified connection points that Dan had missed entirely, and completed each installation faster than Dan could have managed alone. More impressively, Five seemed to understand the purpose of what they were doing. When they encountered a sensor that was reading incorrectly, Five spent several minutes investigating the problem before pointing out a loose connection that Dan hadn't noticed. "You're actually better at this than most of the apprentices," Dan admitted as they finished the 7th installation. "Want to try something more interesting?" Over the next few days, Dan and Five developed an unusual partnership. Dan would explain the basic principles of whatever system they were working on, and Five would find creative solutions to problems that hadn't occurred to the engineering textbooks. Five learned to operate diagnostic equipment, understand schematic displays, and even perform basic welding operations. Dan learned that honey badgers were excellent at thinking outside conventional parameters and had no respect for impossible solutions. The partnership might have continued indefinitely if Five hadn't discovered the ship's weapons locker during one of his independent explorations. Dan found Five in Storage Base C, carefully examining a pulse rifle that he'd somehow removed from its security mounting. The honey badger was holding the weapon correctly, which was disturbing, and appeared to be studying its construction with professional interest. Okay, that's probably not a good idea, Dan said, reaching for the rifle. Five looked at him and made a sound that Dan had learned meant, "But this is interesting." "I know it's interesting, but that's a weapon, not a tool." Five tilted his head and pointed at the rifle's power coupling, then at Dan's welding torch. His meaning was clear. What was the difference between a device that produced controlled energy bursts for construction and one that produced controlled energy bursts for other purposes? Dan realized he didn't have a good answer to that question. "The difference is intent," he said finally. "Tools are for building things. Weapons are for destroying things." Five considered this, then carefully returned the rifle to its mounting. But Dan noticed that the honey badger spent several more minutes studying the weapon's design before losing interest. That night, Dan lay in his bunk thinking about the philosophical implications of teaching tool use to a species that didn't distinguish between construction and destruction. Five had shown remarkable restraint with the pulse rifle, but Dan couldn't shake the feeling that he'd opened a door he might not be able to close. His concerns proved prophetic when the ship's alarm system activated 3 days later. "All crew to emergency stations," came the announcement. "Unknown vessels approaching. Possible hostile intent." Dan rushed to his assigned position in Engineering Section B, where he found chaos. The ship's defensive systems were online, but several critical components had been damaged during a recent solar storm, and repair crews couldn't access them safely while under potential attack. Through the viewport, Dan could see 3 unmarked ships moving into attack formation. The Aurora's Edge was a research vessel, not a warship, and their defensive options were limited even under the best circumstances. "Shields are at 60%, reported engineering lead Bren over the communication system. "We can't access the primary generator to make repairs without exposing crew to radiation." Dan looked at the repair requirements and realized that the damaged components were located in sections that required someone small, brave, and completely unconcerned by danger to reach them. Someone exactly like Five. Dan grabbed a portable toolkit and went looking for a honey badger. He found Five in his usual spot, systematically disassembling a maintenance panel that he'd apparently found insufficiently interesting the first time around. "Five," Dan said urgently. "I need your help with something important." Five looked up from his work, assessed Dan's expression, and apparently decided that whatever was happening was more interesting than maintenance panels. "We need to fix the shield generators," Dan explained, showing Five the schematic on his tablet. "But they're in a place where humans can't safely go." Five studied the display, then looked at Dan's toolkit. After a moment, he selected several specific tools and secured them to the makeshift harness that Dan had built for him weeks earlier. "This could be dangerous," Dan warned. Five gave him a look that clearly communicated his opinion of danger, safety, and the general concept of self-preservation. "Right," Dan said. "Stupid question." Outside the ship, the unknown vessels were moving closer, and the Aurora's Edge's limited weapons were powering up for what would probably be a very short battle. Inside the ship, a human and a honey badger were about to attempt something that would either save everyone aboard or create a very interesting footnote in galactic history. Dan had the uncomfortable feeling that it might be both. The first blast from the pirate ship sent tremors through the Aurora's Edge that Dan felt in his bones. Emergency lighting bathed everything in red as the ship's defensive system struggled to respond to the attack. In the engineering section, status displays flickered between amber warnings and urgent red alerts. "Shields down to 40%, came the announcement from the bridge. "Hull breach in Section D. All repair teams to emergency stations." Dan checked the schematic on his tablet one more time, then looked at Five, who was securing the last tool to his harness with movements that suggested he'd been preparing for space combat his entire life. "The shield generator is 3 decks down, behind about 30 meters of radiation-flooded corridors," Dan explained. "You'll need to access it through the maintenance shafts. replace the damaged coupling, and get out before the radiation exposure becomes lethal. 5 examined the route Dan had traced on the display, then pointed at a section of the ship's blueprint that Dan had marked as impassable. "That's a waste disposal chute," Dan said. "It's too narrow for anyone to fit through." 5 gave him a look that suggested Dan still didn't understand honey badger capabilities despite weeks of evidence. "Right," Dan corrected himself. "It's too narrow for anyone except you." Another blast rocked the ship stronger this time. Through the communication system, they could hear Chief Security Officer Nala coordinating defensive efforts. But the Aurora's Edge wasn't built for this kind of fight. 5 adjusted his harness one final time, picked up the replacement coupling that weighed nearly as much as he did, and headed for the nearest access panel. 5, Dan called after him. "Be careful." The honey badger paused and looked back at Dan with an expression that clearly said careful wasn't in his vocabulary. But he appreciated the sentiment. What happened next would later be described in engineering reports as impossible, and in security footage as like watching physics give up. 5 somehow compressed himself and his equipment into the waste disposal chute, which according to every measurement was physically too small to accommodate his body mass. Dan tracked 5's progress through the ship's internal sensors, watching as the honey badger navigated a route that took him through spaces that weren't supposed to exist, past systems that should have been lethal to organic life, and around obstacles that engineering crews typically needed heavy equipment to bypass. Meanwhile, the battle outside was going badly. The pirates had identified the Aurora's Edge as a soft target and were systematically wearing down its defenses. The research vessel's weapons were designed more for asteroid mining than actual combat, and they weren't having much effect against military-grade shields. "Shields at 20%, came another announcement. Weapons systems operating at reduced capacity, requesting assistance from any vessels in the area. The nearest help was 6 hours away, which might as well have been 6 years. Dan's tablet showed 5 approaching the damaged shield generator. The radiation levels in that area were high enough to kill most organic life within minutes. But 5 seemed completely unbothered by this fact as he began working on the coupling. Through the ship's engineering cameras, Dan watched 5 perform repairs that should have required a full technical team. The honey badger's approach was methodical and efficient, showing an understanding of the ship's systems that impressed even Dan, who had helped train him. "Dan, what's your status?" came engineering lead Bren's voice through the communication system. "We're reading some kind of activity in the shield generator room, but our sensors show lethal radiation levels." 5 is down there making repairs, Dan reported. 5 who? "We don't have anyone named 5 on the engineering roster." The honey badger, there, was a long pause on the communication channel. "Did you just tell me that a small Earth mammal is performing critical repairs in a radiation-flooded section of the ship?" Bren asked. "Yeah, and he's doing a better job than most of our regular crews would," Dan replied, watching 5 complete the coupling replacement and begin testing the connections. Another pause. "Longer this time? I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that," Bren said finally. "Just tell me when the shields are back online." 5 finished his work and began making his way back through the ship's infrastructure. The route he chose was different from the one he'd used going in, apparently because he'd identified a more efficient path during his repairs. On Dan's tablet, the shield generator status display flickered from red to amber, then finally to green. "Shield generators are back online," Dan reported. "Confirmed," came the response from the bridge. "Shields now at full power. Unknown how, but we're reading normal operating parameters across all systems." The change in the battle was immediate. With full shields restored, the Aurora's Edge could withstand the pirates' attacks long enough to bring its own weapons to bear effectively. The research vessel might not be a warship, but its industrial cutting beams could slice through pirate ship hulls like paper when properly focused. 5 emerged from an access panel near Dan's position, covered in radioactive dust but otherwise unharmed. The honey badger looked pleased with himself, which Dan had learned was 5's default expression after solving an interesting problem. "Good work," Dan said, checking 5 over for injuries, "though I'm pretty sure you just absorbed enough radiation to kill a small planet." 5 shrugged, which was an impressive gesture for a creature without proper shoulders. The battle outside ended quickly once the Aurora's Edge could fight back effectively. Pirates preferred easy targets, and a research vessel with full defensive systems and functioning weapons wasn't worth the risk. The three ships broke off their attack and jumped to hyperspace, leaving behind only some minor hull damage and a very confused crew. In the aftermath, Dan found himself explaining the situation to a room full of senior officers who were having difficulty processing what they'd just witnessed. "Let me understand this correctly," said Chief Security Officer Nala. Her mandibles clicking in patterns Dan had learned indicated extreme confusion. "You trained a honey badger to perform spaceship repairs?" "I didn't train him," Dan corrected. "I just showed him how the tools worked. 5 figured out the rest himself. And then you sent this creature into a radiation zone that would have killed any member of this crew?" 5 volunteered, Dan said, which wasn't technically true but felt accurate given 5's enthusiasm for the project. Engineering lead Bren studied the repair reports on his tablet with the expression of someone whose understanding of reality was being systematically dismantled. "The work is perfect," he admitted reluctantly. "Not just functional, but actually better than our standard repair protocols. This creature performed modifications that should have required advanced engineering training." "Honey badgers are very good at figuring things out," Dan explained. Dr. Sam Bennett, who had been conspicuously quiet during the debriefing, finally spoke up. "Dan," he said carefully, "what exactly have you been teaching 5? Dan realized that this was the moment when his weeks of unauthorized experimentation with an alien-adjacent Earth mammal would either be forgiven as heroic innovation or punished as catastrophic irresponsibility. "Basic tool use, mechanical principles, and problem-solving techniques," he said. "Also some welding, electronics repair, and system diagnostics." "System diagnostics?" Nala repeated. "He's really good at finding problems in complex systems," Dan explained. "Better than most of our diagnostic equipment, actually." 5, who had been quietly grooming radioactive dust from his fur, looked up at the mention of his name and made a sound that might have been honey badger pride. "This creature just saved the ship," Bren said slowly, as if saying the words aloud might help him believe them, "and caused a massive security breach," Nala added, "and demonstrated problem-solving abilities that exceed most sapient species." Dr. Bennett contributed, "and somehow survived radiation exposure that should have been lethal," Dan finished. They all looked at 5, who had returned to grooming himself with complete indifference to the philosophical crisis he was causing. "What do we do now?" Nala asked. Nobody had a good answer to that question, but Dan was starting to get some ideas that probably violated even more regulations than the ones he'd already broken. Outside the ship, space was peaceful again, but inside the Aurora's edge, everyone was beginning to realize that their understanding of both Earth fauna and the definition of research specimen was about to change dramatically. The message from Galactic Council headquarters arrived exactly 48 hours after the pirate incident, which meant someone had been monitoring their communications more closely than anyone had realized. The official seal on the transmission indicated maximum priority, and the sender identification made Chief Security Officer Nala's mandibles click in patterns that indicated imminent career death. Ambassador Kira of the Zenthari Diplomatic Corps was coming aboard the Aurora's Edge to investigate potential violations of the Biological Weapons Treaty, and she was bringing a full investigative team. "This is bad," Dr. Sam Bennett said, reading the message for the 3rd time. "This is extremely bad." Dan Walsh sat in the briefing room trying to look like someone who hadn't spent the last month teaching advanced engineering to a honey badger. "How bad are we talking?" "The Biological Weapons Treaty prohibits the development, testing, or deployment of any organism or biological system for military purposes," Nala explained. "Violations can result in species-wide sanctions, trade embargoes, and complete exclusion from the Galactic Council." "But we didn't develop 5 as a weapon," Dan protested. "I was just bored and he was good at solving problems." "Try explaining that to Ambassador Kira," Sam said grimly. "The Zenthari wrote most of the biological weapons legislation. They take this stuff very seriously." Engineering lead Bren's crystalline skin was cycling through worried purple patterns as he reviewed the technical reports from the pirate attack. The repairs 5 performed were beyond the capabilities of most engineering teams. From an outside perspective, it could appear that we deliberately created a biological weapon system. 5 isn't a weapon, Dan insisted. He's just really good at fixing things. As if summoned by his name, Five appeared in the briefing room doorway, having apparently decided that the ventilation system was a more interesting route than the corridor. The honey badger looked around the room, assessed the tension level, and settled down near Dan's chair with the air of someone attending a mildly interesting lecture. "How does he keep doing that?" Nala asked. "We secured that room specifically to prevent unauthorized access." "Security systems are just puzzles to Five," Dan explained. "He doesn't see them as barriers, just interesting problems to solve." Five confirmed, this by casually pointing out that the room's supposedly secure communication panel was accessible through a maintenance hatch that nobody had thought to lock. Ambassador Kira arrived 6 hours later aboard a diplomatic vessel that made the Aurora's Edge look like a maintenance shuttle. The Zenthari ambassador was tall, elegant, and radiated the kind of authority that came from representing a species that had been manipulating galactic politics since before humans discovered fire. Her investigative team included weapons specialists, biological experts, and a legal team that Sam privately thought could prosecute a case against entropy itself. "Dr. Bennett," Ambassador Kira said as she reviewed the initial reports, "you were responsible for the Earth fauna research program aboard this vessel?" "Yes, Ambassador. The program was approved by the Galactic Council's Scientific Review Board and operates under Standard Biological Research Protocols, standard protocols that apparently include training small carnivores to perform military engineering." Sam tried to think of a response that wouldn't make things worse. The training was unauthorized and conducted by engineering apprentice Walsh during his off-duty hours. Ambassador Kira turned her attention to Dan, who was beginning to understand why diplomats were paid so much more than engineers. "Mr. Walsh, please explain how you came to believe that teaching tool used to unearth predator was an appropriate recreational activity." Dan looked at Five, who was currently examining the ambassador's security detail with professional interest. The Zenthari guards were armed with weapons Dan didn't recognize, and Five seemed to be cataloging their capabilities with the detached curiosity of a weapons inspector. "I was bored," Dan said finally. Five was good at solving problems. It seemed like a natural fit. "You were bored," Ambassador Kira repeated. "So you decided to create what amounts to a biological weapons platform." "Five isn't a weapons platform," Dan protested. "He's a honey badger who learned to use tools. A honey badger who can perform military-grade repairs under combat conditions while surviving lethal radiation exposure." "Well, when you put it like that, it does sound impressive." Ambassador Kira was about to respond when Five decided that the conversation had gone on long enough without anyone asking his opinion. The honey badger stood up, walked over to the ambassador's chief security officer, and calmly disarmed him. The process took approximately 3 seconds and involved Five somehow bypassing both the weapon's security locks and the guard's trained reflexes. Before anyone could react, Five was holding the guard's sidearm and examining it with the focused attention of a professional weapons evaluator. "Interesting design," Dan observed, because apparently his survival instincts had completely shut down. "Is that a plasma discharge system or a particle beam?" Five looked at Dan and made a sound that clearly meant particle beam, obviously, then proceeded to field strip the weapon with movements that suggested he'd been doing this his entire life. The security guard stood frozen, staring at his disassembled weapon in the paws of a small Earth mammal, who seemed to understand its construction better than he did. "How did it know where the safety mechanisms were?" the guard asked in a voice that suggested his worldview was collapsing in real time. "Five is very good at understanding how things work," Dan explained. "He probably figured out your weapon's design just by watching you carry it." Ambassador Kira watched Five reassemble the weapon with precise, efficient movements, then politely return it to the security guard before settling back down next to Dan's chair. "Mr. Walsh," she said carefully, "exactly how long did it take you to teach this creature those skills?" "I didn't teach him weapons handling," Dan said. "I just showed him basic tool use. Five figured out the weapon stuff on his own." "In how much time?" Dan thought about this. "About 30 seconds just now." Ambassador Kira was quiet for a long moment, watching Five groom himself with complete indifference to the diplomatic crisis he'd just created. "Dr. Bennett," she said finally, "I need you to understand the implications of what I've just witnessed. This creature demonstrated the ability to instantly analyze, disarm, and reassemble an advanced weapon system that requires specialized training for most sapient species to operate safely. That's just how honey badgers are, Sam said weakly. They're very adaptable. Adaptable enough to learn complex technical skills from watching humans work? Apparently. And you discovered this because an engineering apprentice was bored? That's accurate. Ambassador Kira turned to her legal team, who were frantically taking notes and probably calculating the diplomatic fallout from this incident. The biological weapons treaty was written under the assumption that weaponizing biological systems would require deliberate, long-term development programs, she said. We never considered the possibility that a species might accidentally create a biological weapons platform because one of their crew members was understimulated. So are we in trouble? Dan asked. Mr. Walsh, your species has just demonstrated the ability to take what you consider ordinary animal life and transform it into something that could revolutionize military engineering. Whether you intended this or not, the strategic implications are enormous. 5. Apparently sensing that he was the center of attention again, looked up from his grooming and made a sound that Dan had learned meant, "What's the big deal?" "The big deal," Ambassador Kira said, addressing 5 directly, "is that you represent a completely new category of potential threats that no one was prepared for." 5 tilted his head and pointed at Dan, then at himself, then made a gesture that clearly communicated, "We were just having fun." "Fun," Ambassador Kira repeated. "You've potentially altered the balance of power in the galaxy because you were having fun," Dan was beginning, to suspect that boredom might not be an adequate defense for accidentally creating what everyone kept insisting was a biological weapon system. "Ambassador," he said carefully. "What happens now?" Ambassador Kira looked at 5, who had discovered the briefing room's holographic display system and was apparently trying to figure out how to operate it. "Now," she said, "we try to explain to the Galactic Council that humanity has weaponized a honey badger by accident, and somehow hope that doesn't start an interstellar incident." 5 successfully activated the holographic display and began projecting what appeared to be technical specifications for improved shield generators. On the positive side, Ambassador Kira added, "Your honey badger might have just solved several of our most persistent engineering problems." Dan looked at the display, then at 5, then at the assembled diplomats and security officers who were all staring at a small Earth mammal who was casually revolutionizing space technology. "So, we're definitely in trouble," he concluded. "Mr. Walsh," Ambassador Kira said, "trouble doesn't begin to describe what you've done." 6 months later, the Galactic Council's Special Committee on Biological Security published document 2847B, officially known as the 5 Protocols. The document ran to 347 pages and included detailed specifications for containing, transporting, and interacting with what the committee diplomatically termed Earth's problem-solving fauna. The protocols were named after their primary inspiration, who was currently sitting in Engineering Lab 7 aboard the Aurora's Edge, wearing a custom-designed harness that contained more advanced technology than most starships. Dan Walsh, now Senior Engineering Specialist with a commendation for innovative problem-solving under extreme circumstances, watched 5 examine a new puzzle box he'd designed specifically for honey badger entertainment, any species that can escape from 17 different containment systems, master complex tool use in under a week, and perform military-grade repairs while surviving lethal radiation. Dan read from the official report. Shall be classified as a Category 5 strategic asset and handled according to the attached protocols. 5 looked up from his puzzle box and made a sound that Dan had learned meant, did they really name a whole classification system after me? They did, Dan confirmed. Congratulations. You're officially the most diplomatically significant honey badger in galactic history. Dr. Sam Bennett entered the lab carrying a data pad and wearing the expression of someone who had spent 6 months explaining honey badger behavior to increasingly confused alien bureaucrats. The Trelawney have finally agreed to resume trade negotiations, he announced, but only if 5 agrees to a formal diplomatic role as proof of human commitment to peaceful applications of biological technology. 5 examined the idea for a moment, then pointed at his current project, which appeared to be a device for automatically opening any lock ever invented. He says he'll consider it if they can provide more interesting engineering challenges. Dan translated. How do you know that's what he said? We've been working together for months. You pick up the language. This was true. Dan and Five had developed a communication system that involved gestures, tool manipulation, and what could only be described as collaborative problem solving. Other species found it disturbing to watch a human and honey badger discuss complex engineering concepts, using nothing but paw movements and mechanical demonstrations. Ambassador Kira entered the lab, followed by her usual security detail, who had learned to keep their weapons secured around Five not because he was dangerous, but because he would inevitably improve their design if given the opportunity. Mr. Walsh, Dr. Bennett, she said formally, then nodded to Five. Citizen Five. The Xanthari had been the first species to grant Five official diplomatic status, mainly because Ambassador Kira had concluded that any being capable of solving galactic engineering problems deserved formal recognition. The fact that Five was technically a non-sapient Earth mammal was considered a minor bureaucratic detail. Ambassador, Dan replied, what brings you to our lab? The hegemony has requested a demonstration of human biological integration capabilities. They're considering a technology sharing agreement, but they want proof that the honey badger incident wasn't a dangerous accident. Five looked up from his puzzle box with interest. The hegemony was known for their advanced materials science, and Five had been hoping for access to their technical databases since learning of their existence. What kind of demonstration? Sam asked carefully. Nothing dramatic. Simply a showing that Five's capabilities can be applied to peaceful engineering problems rather than military applications. Five made a series of gestures that Dan had learned meant, finally, something interesting to do. He's in, Dan translated. What's the project? Ambassador Kira produced a holographic display showing a space station design. The hegemony has been trying to solve a construction problem for the past 5 years. They need to install sensitive equipment in an area that's too dangerous for most biological life and too complex for automated systems. Five studied the display with the focused attention he usually reserved for particularly challenging locks. Radiation? Dan asked. Worse. Temporal distortion fields that disrupt most electronic systems and cause severe disorientation in most sapient species. But honey badgers don't get disoriented, Dan said, understanding immediately. And Five has already demonstrated immunity to radiation and an ability to work effectively in hostile environments. Five pointed at the display, then at his harness, then made a gesture that clearly communicated, when do we start? The demonstration took place 3 weeks later aboard Hegemony Station Alpha 7, with representatives from 12 different species watching, as Five calmly worked his way through temporal distortion fields that made seasoned engineers physically ill. Dan monitored Five's progress from the safety of the observation deck, watching as the honey badger installed precision equipment in areas where reality itself seemed slightly unstable. How is it possible that the creature is unaffected by temporal distortion? Asked the hegemony's chief engineer, a crystalline being whose voice carried harmonics that suggested deep confusion. Honey badgers don't care about temporal distortion, Dan explained. They don't care about most things. That would stop other species. But temporal distortion affects the fundamental flow of time itself. Five doesn't really do fundamental limitations. On the display, Five completed the final installation with movements that seemed to exist slightly outside normal spacetime, then made his way back to the safe zone with the casual indifference of someone who had just fixed a broken door handle. The equipment he'd installed began functioning immediately, solving a construction problem that had prevented the hegemony from completing their station for half a decade. Remarkable, the chief engineer said. In 15 minutes, your honey badger accomplished what our best teams couldn't manage in 5 years. Five is very efficient, Dan agreed. The hegemony technology sharing agreement was signed that afternoon, with a special provision that Five would be available for consultation on any engineering problems involving hostile environments or temporal anomalies. Similar agreements followed with 7 other species over the next few months. Five became something between a diplomatic asset, an engineering consultant, and a galactic celebrity. His image appeared on recruitment posters for the Galactic Engineering Corps, usually with captions like, "If a honey badger can do it, what's your excuse?" The Aurora's Edge was redesigned as a mobile engineering platform, with Five's lab at its center, and specialized equipment for handling the increasingly complex problems that various species brought to them. Dan found himself promoted to Chief of Biological Engineering Systems, a job title that hadn't existed before. 5, but apparently described exactly what he'd been doing all along. Dr. Bennett received funding for a comprehensive study of human-animal collaboration in technological applications, with the understanding that the research would focus on peaceful rather than military uses. Chief Security Officer Nala was granted early retirement and a pension that reflected her service during unprecedented biological security challenges. She spent her retirement writing security protocols that assumed honey badgers would eventually gain access to whatever they wanted anyway. The real change, though, was in how the galaxy viewed humanity. The species that could accidentally weaponize their wildlife by giving them tools was clearly capable of innovations that other civilizations couldn't predict or prepare for. Pirates learned to avoid any ship broadcasting honey badger on board warnings, not because they feared the honey badger specifically, but because any species crazy enough to arm one was clearly capable of anything. Trade agreements with human colonies included specific provisions for biological consultation services and problem-solving fauna assistance. The Earth Wildlife Preservation Program received funding requests from dozens of species interested in studying other potentially useful Earth animals, though all requests were carefully screened for safety after the 5 incident. 5 himself seemed largely unimpressed by his fame. He continued solving problems, improving equipment designs, and occasionally appearing at diplomatic functions where his presence served as a reminder that the universe was full of possibilities that bureaucrats hadn't thought to regulate yet. Dan often found 5 in his lab late at night, working on projects that pushed the boundaries of known engineering principles. The honey badger had moved beyond simply using tools to actually designing new technologies that no one else had considered possible. "You know," Dan said one evening, watching 5 assemble what appeared to be a faster-than-light communication device from spare parts. "When I first got bored and decided to teach you about tools, I never imagined it would lead to all this." 5 looked up from his work and made a sound that Dan interpreted as, "Neither did I, but it's been interesting." "Any regrets about becoming the most famous honey badger in galactic history?" 5 considered this question seriously, then gestured at his current project, at the advanced lab around them, and at the stars visible through the viewport. His meaning was clear. As long as there were interesting problems to solve and new things to figure out, he didn't care about fame, politics, or galactic diplomacy. He was just a honey badger who happened to be very good at engineering. Dan smiled and returned to his own work, designing new challenges for a colleague who had redefined what was possible when someone got bored and decided to see what would happen if you gave a honey badger some tools. Outside the ship, space stretched endlessly in all directions, full of problems waiting to be solved by the most unlikely partnership in galactic history. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Dan was already wondering what would happen if they tried the same approach with a wolverine.